to lead to the intention of doing that thing, and thus to you doing that thing, right? If you judge it to be the best, that's what should happen. But some people, and we should say really everyone at some point or another, doesn't follow the principle of continence, right? Doesn't follow through on what they see as the most rational choice for them, right? If I put it in this term, in this language, this should help. If we're talking about what is rational to do, if we judge action A or move A as the most rational thing to do, doing B means we did something that went against that rational judgment. Yes?
Can we do like a real life example just so I get it better? Sorry.
So this is the example I was giving with smoking, right?
Yeah.
Or the example that I give in the text is you're making a choice between going out and partying or staying in.
Let's go with that one. I like that one.
Okay. So
Sorry.
this relates better to you? No, that's fine.
I don't smoke, so.
Okay, so this will make more sense to you. All right, so if you're choosing between A is staying in, studying for a test that you have the next day, it's a very important test, it makes up a large percentage of your grade for this class. This particular class is an important class for your major. Your major is something you've always wanted to do. See how I'm piling it on here? So in order to make this thought experiment function, if you look at that from a distance and you judge that to be the most rational thing for you to do, then B, which is going out, partying that night, having a good time with your friends, perhaps getting a chance to flirt with the person who you really want to flirt with, he or she is going to end up at the same venue. It has its appeal, but you see, you admit to yourself, you judge, you evaluate that A is the most rational move. It's the most rational choice. And yet you end up with B. So the question is how do you do that which you see to be less rational? So you behaving in an irrational way. And what we're trying to do is, how do we explain this irrationality? Because you would admit that humans do things all the time that, at least in hindsight, we say, those are irrational things. Right? Yes?
It's pretty well saying the two different types of judgments, like the way you evaluate things, rational and unconditional and conditional, prima facie judgment.
Right. So what Davidson does is he, looking at this scheme, he says, well, here's how we explain that irrationality. There are two types of judgments. There are all considered judgments, right? And those judgments, you know, as it says, it takes everything into consideration. And then there are judgments where as soon as you make them, it starts that chain reaction. And what he says is, here's what the problem is. Somebody who recognizes that staying in and studying for this class, which is for this test, which is important for this class, which is important for their major, which is important for what they want to do, they see this as being rational. And their all things considered judgment says this is what we should do. But they never make the leap to the other kind of judgment. And that's where he says they have contravened the principle of continence. That if you are behaving rationally, it should become that other kind of judgment. So what he does is he splits judgment making into two types of judgments. That's one of his unique moves. And then he says that the problem isn't that we're illogical, but we act irrationally. Do you see how that's an important distinction? Probably not, so let me explain this. There's a difference between acting illogically and acting irrationally. To act illogically is to do something that is seemingly logically impossible. And that's why people were very confused about acrasia, weakness of the will, incontinence, because it seemed to be logically impossible. And what Davidson does, look at this really interesting move he makes. He says, he looks at the problem, and he realizes that people are making a mistake in how they think about it. He says, no. It's not that it's illogical, it's irrational, and those are two different things. And let me show you how it's irrational. It's irrational because people aren't following a principle of rationality. And by splitting it into two types of judgment, here's what he's done. He's shown how it isn't that hard for people to make that irrational choice. So, again, to make sure that this is clear about why this is a problem and why the solution matters, it's a problem because, as people saw it, we couldn't understand how people did this, right? How did people engage in this behavior? It didn't make sense, right? It didn't make sense to Socrates, didn't make sense to Aristotle, and lots of people in between. By the time we get to Davidson in the 1960s, 70s, he says, nope, you're thinking about it wrong. So he reconfigures the problem, and he splits it into logical and irrational, and he says, no, they're not being illogical. They're not being illogical because we can see how they can make this mistake. And if they can make this mistake, that means that it isn't illogical, right? It means it can happen. But they are irrational. And then he shows how people can be so easily that irrational. And in the process, he shows potentially how to solve the problem. Solving the problem means making clear to people that there should be a tight connection between what they evaluate to be the rational choice, the most rational choice, and this last chain of events, intention and action. That in our minds, when we judge something to be rational, it should trigger our intentions and into our actions. So if we say it's the most rational thing for us to do is to stay home and study for this incredibly valuable this incredibly worthwhile test, for an incredibly worthwhile class, for an incredibly worthwhile major, for an incredibly worthwhile career. If we say all that to ourselves, it should trigger our intention and trigger our action. So here's the issue. The issue is we have to go into the psychology of why these things are splitting apart. That becomes something that Davidson can't totally explain. And at the end, if you look at the end of this section, on weakness of the will, from about 29, pages 29 to 31. Right? So at the bottom of 29, Davidson writes, or excuse me, I write about Davidson. The principle of continence, Davidson argues, which ought to govern our choosing as rational agents, and is implied in our rational ability to choose, tells us to, quote, perform the action judged best on the basis of all available relevant reasons. The Acrates, that is the person who is incontinent, who has a weak will, fails to abide by the principle of continence. And this is another philosopher. As Stroud puts it, quote, the weak-willed agent then has a reason for doing B, right? We have reasons for going out that night. Some of them are pretty good reasons, right? We really, really don't want to be single anymore, right? We really, really like this person. We really, really don't want to miss out. FOMO, right? So we have reasons. So she says, the weak-willed agent then has a reason for doing B and does B for that reason. What he lacks, and lacks by his own lights, that is, it's clear to him that he lacks this, is a sufficient reason to do B given all the considerations that he has taken to favor A. So here's the problem. This is why it is about rationality and not being illogical. Before, when they looked at the problem and they said it was illogical, they said they didn't explicitly state that people have good reasons to do the other option, right? Socrates, when he's talking about people only do wrong because they don't know what's right, fails to see that the things that they do wrong actually have good reasons, right? It's that the problem is, and this is where it's irrational, is that they don't have sufficient reasons. I mean, your reasons for doing B are outweighed by your reasons for doing A. And that's the mistake that people make. They make a mistake somehow, and again, this is the mystery, somehow in our minds, we shift that, right? So how would people try to answer that? Well, as I said, Davidson doesn't quite make clear what's going on here. He tries to split the mind into different parts. And that doesn't seem to do well. So look at 31, right? Subsequently, this is right at the top, Davidson goes on to argue in ensuing work that strict acrasia and wishful thinking and self-deception are not only interlinked, but also accounted for by means of a divided mind, right? This is his solution, which for him finally explains the paradoxes of irrationality. Why do we do this? Why, even when we recognize A as having superior reasons to B, do we not intend and then act to do A? He says because